in large part because I'm a Presbyterian nominally, and the Presbyterians had, like most of the mainstream denominations, had walked out of the inner city with white flight. I struggled with the whole hypocrisy of Harvard Divinity School, where everybody liked the poor, but they didn't like the smell of the poor. People talked about empowering those they never met. And it wasn't far away. It was a 20-minute ride on the Green Line to go over and see where people were warehoused, little better than animals within their own city. And so after 2 years, I took a leave of absence, studied Spanish with the Maryknoll Fathers in Cochabamba, Bolivia, at their language school, drifted off to Argentina just in time for the first Falkland War, covered it for National Public Radio, came back, finished my degree, but at that point knew I wouldn't be ordained, that I was going to go to El Salvador. And I, like many students of the era, had read extensively in liberation theology, although somewhat critically, coming out of Niebuhr. I don't believe in the utopian society. I don't believe that violence can ever be used to create a Christian society. I didn't believe it then. I certainly don't believe it after my intimate relationship with organized violence over the next 2 decades. But I went, I think, for the right reasons. And I spent 5 years in El Salvador, which is probably too long to spend in a conflict of that intensity. By the end, I had a nervous twitch in my face. I was there longer than any other reporter. There was a reporter there who was there for 6 years, but he was killed. 22 reporters were killed when I was there. No reporter stayed 5 years and lived, at least by the time I left. My first firefight took place in a town called Suchitoto, which was off the main trunk haul highway. And it was a remote village that had a small army garrison, and the FMLN rebels had surrounded it. So they'd surrounded the town and were attacking the garrison, which was in the center of the town. And we drove off the trunk haul up that road, stopped at a bridge. The cameramen and the photographers got high. Most combat photographers are high when they do it because once the shooting starts, if you're a print reporter such as myself, you can crawl into a ditch. If you're a camera person, that's when you have to work. You have to stand up. And of course, it's why the percentage of combat journalists who are killed are primarily camera people. And we drove up that road with the odd round fired ahead or behind us until we joined the FMLN rebels who were besieging that garrison. We came around a corner of a house. I was with several rebels, and there was very heavy fire that was laid down from that garrison. Several rebels got shot. I crawled into a small covert, and I remember, and here's somebody who has spent 3 years in seminary. I remember lying there, and your perimeter of fear when you cover combat shrinks, but when it's crossed, and you think you're going to die, it's utter terror. And I can remember lying there praying, if you get me out of this, I will never do this again. It's really embarrassing, but it's true. There was a young rebel soldier, very gravely wounded, died calling out in a cadence for his mother. And when we got back to the capital, San Salvador, we all drank away our fear, and by that night it had become a great cosmic joke. I think most people after such an experience will learn to stay away, but I was hooked. And I think that analogy of a drug is one that I grasped very early on. That war is the most powerful narcotic invented by humankind. And it perverts you, it destroys you, it makes you incapable of living outside of the dark miasma that is war itself, which is why when one conflict would end, you would find war journalists sitting around desperately trying to figure out how they would get to the next one and the one after that. So that by the time I was covering the war in Kosovo, 20 years later, I was doing it with two journalists who I had covered the war with in El Salvador before. The problem with becoming acculturated to war, the essence of which is death, is that, like an addict, you can't exist without those highs, without that familiar band of deformed individuals who understand your own addiction. Everything outside of a war zone seems flat, uninteresting, dull. During the war in Bosnia, I was in Sarajevo, and because we were shelled 24 hours a day, you never slept in Sarajevo, so after about 3 weeks you were pretty useless. And the shelling was very heavy. I was in the Holiday Inn, and the whole front of the building had been sheared off by Serb artillery fire. And when they would start, the shells would start exploding around the Holiday Inn because it would throw out deadly bits of iron fragments. You would crawl as swiftly as you could into your bathtub so that the porcelain could protect you. And I can actually remember some nights not even waking up until I had already automatically crawled into the bathtub. I only actually woke up lying in the bathtub. But when we would leave, we would go to Paris, and I can remember walking down Paris, and it was as if I viewed everything around me through a tunnel. I was numb. I couldn't connect. The only thing I wanted to do was go back. War has a dark beauty filled with the monstrous and the grotesque. I was in an abandoned village by a lake in the war in El Salvador when, with a bunch of rebels, when several Huey helicopters, which if anybody has experience knows are very noisy, started coming in low over the lake to look for us. And we, as these helicopters flew low over the ruined buildings of this village, we pushed ourselves up against the wall so that the helicopters, if they had looked back, they would have seen us. And I remember looking up at these machines that were trying to kill me, these angels of death, and thinking that they were beautiful. There is a kind of dark and frightening beauty to this weaponry, this godlike power to revoke another person's charter to live on this earth. And nobody is immune from these seductive qualities of war, the capacity to destroy, the frightening truth that human beings become intoxicated by the ability not only to destroy things, but to destroy other human beings. All of that is true. And yet, the deeper one sinks into the culture of war, the more their soul is extinguished, the more their capacity to feel is crushed. And I found myself 20 years later, having leapt from war to war to war, breaking down. Everybody has limits. Nobody maintains forever that physical and emotional resiliency. We used to say that there were always two types of war correspondents who were most susceptible to being killed, and that was the young ones who didn't know what they were doing, and the ones that I became, which were the old ones that just got blasé, that for whom war became too familiar. It's possible to be dependent upon the experience of war and yet at the same time hate war. I don't think any of us could look around and see the kind of suffering that was visited, especially on the weak and the innocent, and in particular on children, and not grasp war's cruelty and barbarity. And yet at the same time, we couldn't exist without that experience. I was in Basra at the end of the First Gulf War during the Shiite uprising until I was captured and taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard. I like to say I was embedded with the Iraqi Republican Guard. I was with a few other journalists, and we were held at Basra University, which is where the Republican Guard had their headquarters. Now, the uprising in the South, which had been called for by first President Bush, had seen whole army units defect. Basra itself was chaos. There was shooting everywhere. You never knew block by block who had control. The first night that we were in the university, the rebels tried to take the university, and all the electricity was out. The only thing we could see was the tracers. Every fourth bullet on a machine gun is a tracer, and on a belt fed. And we had to run from the building we were in with our guards to the next building. They smashed the glass doors with the butts of their AK-47s, and we just sat crouched in the hall, knowing that if the rebels made it to that inner building, of course they would just open fire in the hallway and all of us would be killed. The Republican Guard managed to hold them off, and the next morning we were taken by a light armor battalion that was trying to work its way north to Baghdad. And about 60 miles north of Baghdad, we were ambushed. 16 hours of fighting. It was raining, and I remember on that road up, the Allied forces had bombed all the power plants and all the water purification plants, so there was